Welcome to Agile for Executives. This is a program hosted by Agile New England, and I'm Nancy Van Schonderwer. I'm an independent coach, and I'm president of Agile New England, and I'm also heading up the Agile for Executives team. Our seminar today is the fourth in a series of 6, and the topic is the rise of accountability culture, say, do, prove. Before we get going, I have a very brief program note. We'll wrap up as normal in 45 minutes, but stay around because we're going to go for another 10 minutes or so to accommodate extra questions or discussions that people may want to have this time through. Okay, last time when we talked with Andrew and Julian, we found out that the cells in their company were using contracts to trade with each other and without outside services. This is because they had more autonomy than before. And they were doing all this, the contracts and trades, in order to raise their quality to a more consistent level across the company. Today, we're going to learn how a new practice that they call say, do, prove got going and what that meant to them. I think it's got some strong parallels with acceptance test-driven development that we use in Agile, but you can be the judge. When they applied that to the operations work, it went fairly well, and there were good reasons that they wanted to also apply it to the business administration functions. And that turned out to be quite a bit more difficult. And that's pretty much the adventure that led down the path to even further decentralization of work inside the company. That's what we're going to hear about today. I'm going to turn things over to my co-host, Vishal, who's going to say a few words and then get us going today. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Nancy, and welcome everybody to our 4th session in this 6-part series. How small of a work cell is small enough? What does it mean to an ecosystem over time to increase decentralization and reduce dependencies? What is the role of leadership in this change? How do you introduce autonomy while improving accountability? A few questions on our mind, and my mind specifically. Today, we will learn answers to these questions and more as Andrew and Julian continued experimenting and share those experiences around those experiments with their organization to further improve the gains and the engagement in an OODA loop format. For those who are not familiar with OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, and act is a military strategy terminology. And the approach comes from combat operations processes that focus on filtering available information, putting it in context, and quickly making the most appropriate decisions, while also understanding that change can change as more data and information becomes available. Above all, Andrew and Julian helped the organization memorialize the standard work, if I may, a much ignored step to ensure consistency, validation, and confirmation. With that, I'll turn it to our guests, Andrew and Julian. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you very much, Vishal and Nancy. I'm just going to do a short introduction just to bring us up to date in terms of where we are. We've made this mind shift from viewing our organization as a machine to viewing it as an ecosystem. And of course, that's meant there's been a number of changes in our thinking and our actions. The implications were much greater than we thought. So I'm going to hand over to Julian to go into the next phase, and I'll interrupt him as we go along.
Okay, so when you see an organization as a machine, there are some guiding principles and approaches which are established. There's like a formula for operation, which is then cascaded down through a command and control system into everyone, so that everyone plays their role like cogs in the machine.
Does their bit.
Does their bit, yeah. Whereas in an ecosystem, there's sort of a network of people who decide for themselves what they do. You might imagine, I don't know, a forest, and there's a beaver in the forest, and the beaver is set about the task of gnawing down trees and building a dam, and that's quite different to the fish in the river. The ecosystem is full of organisms with different agendas.
So they're kind of like sovereign beings, aren't they?
They
kind
are,
of
but
deciding for themselves what they're going to do.
that's right. So in terms of getting the best out of them, it's not like a machine. There's more fuzzy logic going on. It's not entirely predictable. It's a little bit unpredictable, but nevertheless very efficient. So you've got these two principles: this top-down system of formula and this bottom-up system of fuzzy logic in the ecosystem model. And I think it's worth saying here that when we change this approach, we stop trying to fix the problems with our old model. We chose to try to apply a different model, and which has different problems, and hopefully some of those problems we can live with, unlike the old one, which was just inefficient. For example, in the ecosystem model, you don't need an expensive management team. It's fabulously cheaper.
So don't shout at frogs.
Don't shout at frogs, yeah.
That's the lesson.
So the ecosystem, and specifically our internal market, what that did is establish for us in the organization, without people being told, what the right thing to do was. You know, sort of like when and what to do. And in that internal market, that was the sweet spot, doing the right thing at the right time. But what it didn't deal with is how to do the thing right. That makes sense. To the best procedures to follow to do a specific thing properly. And we were really sorely missing that phase. And we wanted to do that so that we could show everyone, if we were evaluating their merit, was operating on the same level playing field. We weren't dropping the ball in some sense. And in our industry, in the aerospace industry, it's terribly important that everything's run to its standard operating procedures.
Now, can I just interrupt here, just to kind of bring that into a kind of human scale? My view, has come from corporate, was very much, if you control the inputs, control the process, you control the outputs. And Julian's view was, don't have any of that, just control the output. And we were trying to find a way which could somehow accommodate my viewpoint and could accommodate also Julian's outcome viewpoint. So mine was more a process-driven viewpoint, and Julian's was more a final outcome-driven viewpoint. And we did this experiment in my house, actually. It's a very complicated experiment based on a cup of tea. So now you can take it over now, because you were the host of the experiment.
So I think we need to just establish here that we talked in the previous video about reductionism, breaking a bicycle apart into its component parts, and then in the saddle and the brakes, you kind of lose the bicycleness of the components directly. You separate them, and in this one, in terms of creating these standard operating procedures, we were focusing on determinism, right? Cause and effect. If I do this, this happens, and you get that output. This classic process control. If you control the process, you control the outcome.
It's like a lever, isn't it? You pull the lever and operates the signal. And
then what you do is you take blocks out of the Jenga tower to improve the efficiency and reduce the waste of that process until it's as lean as you can possibly do it. And one of the things it's easy to miss here is the fact that it requires the operators in this like production line process to be compliant and conforming. So they have to do what they're told, and they have to do it properly. And it very much makes them a cog in a machine by using determinism. And if you're going to use a fuzzy logic, you you have the opportunity for the operator to do kind of what they choose to do themselves. And that has a possibility of losing control. And on the other hand, it has the possibility of gaining productivity. And that's what we were going for in this ecosystem.
But also
model.
putting right things that have gone wrong, of course. So if things do go wrong, like somebody doesn't turn up to work because they're ill, yeah, the operator then has the ability in the fuzzy logic machine to put that right, because putting that right, that thing you didn't expect, putting that right is critical to maintain the process, shall we call it? We'll change the name of that as we go forward, on track.
Yeah, so and we've been battling with this problem of standard operating procedures, SOPs, for years. They never seemed really good at controlling our processes and controlling our outcomes. You know, there were always quality or delivery issues because of delays and stuff we hadn't expected. So we're back to Andrew's Andrew's house, and we tried to unwrap. We tried to come up with an alternative way of doing this, more like an ecosystem. So we set ourselves a challenge of doing a thought experiment of creating a standard operating procedure for something like that was simple and unrelated to our work life, and that was creating a standard operating procedure for making a cup of tea. And it was well enough outside of our day-to-day experience that we didn't drag into all the kind of the details and subcontractors and thoughts and feelings of our marketplace, but it just got us to think about the principles of how we're going to control our processes. So we set about the problem of writing down every step to make a cup of tea, and we got to 27 eventually. A long instruction sheet. I mean, it was very long, and eventually we thought, well, we've got enough of it now. We've got a good process now.
What could go wrong?
What could go
we
wrong?
thought to ourselves, because we're very intelligent, you know.
Now,
what could possibly go wrong?
And whilst we were doing this, Andrew's wife came home, and she said, "Oh, what are you doing there? Do you want me to make a cup of tea while we're waiting? While you're working?" So she said that, and what we noticed was that our prediction of how long it would take and all the process that would be involved weren't that accurate when it came to his wife making the tea herself. Well, that had a profound implication in terms of how well could we predict the costs that went into something if we couldn't plan and arrange something as simple as making a cup of tea. And also, we realized that our whole 27 processes in our instructions probably wouldn't predict how good the cup of tea was at the end. They're controlling the process like boiling the kettle and sniffing the milk and things like that, but they didn't necessarily say at the end you're going to have an ideal cup of tea. But the worst of all, you know, we took a number of conclusions from this thought experiment. One was it was unusable and unwieldy. It was just too long. Secondly, creating it was time consuming and therefore costly.
Yeah.
Thirdly, it wasn't predictive of the
outcome
and the quality of the cup of tea. Fourthly, it was more difficult to change the standard operating procedure than it was to change how you made the cup of tea. So the process was now more unwieldy than the actual making of the tea.
In fact, the reality was you wouldn't change the process. You just changed the making of the cup of tea. So therefore was no longer a set of instructions. It was just a dream.
And the point about these four things was they actually reflected our experience at work with our standing operating procedures. So it was clear by then this thought experiment had been enough to prove to us that we needed an alternative way of approaching this problem. Now, Andrew says he's more focused on the process from corporate, control the process, you control the outcome. And I came much more from a development world where you set the outcome and whatever you do during the development process is to make sure the outcome comes out right, because that's what's going to be evaluated.
Yeah, but it never did though. That's the problem. The problem is by the time you added so much value, by the time it got to the outcome, you found an error in the outcome, you put it in the bin, and you added huge amounts of value to it. And that was a huge problem for me to accept Julian's position, by the way, because it's fine in a development environment where you're doing one prototype, but when you're doing 500 or 100 or 10 or 15 non-prototypes, in other words, productionized units, that was not an acceptable approach to me. So that left us in a situation we needed to find a new way forward. So what was that position that we could actually come to the point where it was satisfying my needs of having some internal or some pre-finished process inspections, should we say, and a final acceptance test. So Julian's point, I think, there was?
Well, my point is that somebody came up with an alternative, a really good idea of this gateway inspection system. That just happened to be me.
He was a genius.
And the gateway inspection was going to reflect more like what happens in the outside world. So in the outside world, you have supply chains. And in supply chains, it's up to the supplier what they do in their part of the supply chain. And then in order for their products to be passed along to the supply chain, there's contracts that go between customer and supplier. And there's usually an inspection, an outgoing inspection, an incoming inspection of the goods as they pass along. So instead of defining how to do something along the way, we defined what inspection processes it had to go, a gateway had to pass through in order for it to be considered conforming. And if there's any problem in quality at any time, we just went back to the inspection process and said, we'll amend that and update that so it catches any future problems. So if a problem occurs, it can never happen again. And that really reduced the details now in our standard operating procedures. Instead of being 27 separate processes, we probably had 6 or 7 gateway inspection processes. And now those could be done by different people, different cells in the organization, or they could just all be done by one person. They just had to make sure as they passed through the inspection gateways that records were kept, that on each part of the process, the product was conforming on each step.
So the requirements for the gateway, were first of all written down and formalized. Secondly, that when that product went through the gateway, that whatever the results were, they were recorded as well. And then a decision was made whether the results met requirements. And if the answer was yes, it could pass through the gateway. And the person who was the operator, or the person that was making the product, had to have hard evidence that that particular component or part or sub-assembly could pass through.
Okay, so the key benefit of this gateway process, other than the fact that the standard operating procedure is a much smaller document and more easy to change, was that even in its brevity, you still have the opportunity between these gateway inspections to continuously improve the processes that went between. There was an opportunity for that lean continuous improvement process to carry on without changing the inspection gateways. And that was critical, because we knew we had to integrate this ability to constantly improve in 1,000 little ways every day, rather than having a standard operating procedure which perhaps cost $1,000 to change, and it was never worth doing updating the standard operating procedure for changes that may save you only $200. And it's especially an issue in our organization where so little of our products repeated. So it was kind of lost. So we did that, and we called this approach, this gateway approach, we called them recipes. We created a recipe, with like a method. The method was really loose, but it had these gateways in it. And in the recipe were all was first of all the ingredients you needed, and then all the templates for the forms you had to fill out, all the inspection record forms, and a mechanism for controlling those.
So just to be clear though, because that sounds horrific, and it wasn't horrific. It was, you know, it was literally one document which you filled in, yeah, the requirements and the results. And it could be done very simply, very easily. It was handy. We didn't now have these reams and reams of papers. We had a requirement and we had a record. And the requirement tended to be static. And every time you produce something, yeah, you update it with a record. So we had a really simple system of blue files for recipes, green files for records. So when you turn the handle, we called it realize, the recipe to produce the outcome, you had a little form which went into the green file saying, this is the record of going through the gateway reviews. And it really was incredibly simple.
Okay, so
and yet complied with the highest standards, by the way.
Now, so what happened then is our production team, this was so simple for our production team. In fact, they viewed it as an improvement. They were less unwieldy, and they could integrate change rather than having to go through a long loop for a simple improvement. A long loop through the drawing office and drawing change notes and all that control system for really a minor change which wouldn't even change form, fit, or function.
So a minor process change.
Minor process change. So we liked this process so much so that we decided to spill that out into our administrative and management functions as well. So we were taking this production technique and we were using it in our admin. And the first thing we came across that in terms of establishing requirements, our customers were good at that, and we knew that trickled down through our production processes. But in terms of our administrative and management processes, it wasn't so clear what the requirements were. And often, you know, they were way back up in, say, a legal requirement to make a tax submission or something like that. Or let me take an example. The European Working Hours Directive that says people can't work more than a certain number of hours per week, and they're not allowed to work more than a certain number of hours aggregated over 10 weeks as an average. So the result of that is you had to count people's hours.
So I'm just going to add something in here, though, because I think it's an important point for people who are viewing. And that is that when we started to dig into these administrative departments, what we really found was that they had no idea what the requirements that applied to them were. So when I went to the accounts department and said, could you tell me the requirements for the accounts department and where they're written down? No, I just do my job.
Do what I've always done.
I do what I've always done, and this is how it works, Andrew, and this is the computer, and you press this button, and it does this thing, and then that comes out, and bang, 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 and look, it's all magic. I said, fantastic, yeah, but I get that, but where's the requirements?
So knowing the requirements is critical for knowing what the right thing is to do. And then having some sort of standard operating procedure, make sure that you did that thing right, did it properly and correctly, perhaps to a schedule or something, a quarterly schedule, if you were in the accounts department. And they were completely missing this stuff. So we thought, fantastic, well, we'll rewrite those. And boy, that was a giant undertaking.
Yeah, that was me. You gave that to me. Thanks very much.
Well, you know.
So that was my job. You see, he invents all that nonsense about thing, and I get, here's this little rubbish.
Somebody has to.
You get all the requirements for all the things and put them together. There you are, that's fair.
Somebody has to have the big ideas and somebody has to dig the ditches, obviously. So we started doing, and boy, we found a lot of requirements. Some of these requirements, I mean, a lot of them, like the legal requirements have a system for death in service. You're never going to use that. Most likely, you're never going to use it but you have to have it. It's a requirement in employment law in Europe. So you have to have a recipe for that. You have to know when it's going to be triggered and what you have to do and what the outcome is and when you've got to do it and things like that.
A recipe for catching working hours,
Yep.
working hours directive, so on and on and on and on.
We had, in the end, if we separate sales, design, and manufacture as the area where we add value, the control recipes were by far the biggest proportion, not just bigger than each one of the sales, design, and manufacturing, but in aggregate, it was bigger than all of them. So it's more than 50% of the recipes. And we ended up with about 220 recipes. And so more than 120 were these administrative recipes of one sort or another in HR, in accounts, and things like that.
Quality is another one.
Yeah. So let's just recap then on these recipes. They had this simple principle: say, do, prove. So in a contract, there's a meeting of minds where you agree to do something in the future. So you declare that you're going to do something in a supply chain, both externally to our business or internally. We place an order on a supplier and agree that for this amount of money, you give me this product. So in that contract, there's an agreement to do something in the future, and we call that the say. And then let's say the supplier gets on with the job, and we call that the do. And the most important thing in the do, if you remember, is the paper trail that gets generated during the inspection processes, the inspection gateways. So they say, well, here's the product. Oh, and here's the pile of inspection records we have as it's passed through all those gateways to confirm the product is compliant.
So the green file, the record file, contains that.
So here's the cake, and here's all the checks I made on the way through making this cake.
So the recipe for the cake, blue file. The cake, by realizing the recipe, and then the record of making the cake in the green file. Dead simple.
So yeah, and what Andrew's alluding to there is the physical colors of the physical ring binders we were using to capture the data to separate this stuff, just to make it easy for everyone on their bench. So then at the end of it, you then had the product, and you had then all the accumulation of all the inspection gateways the product had been through, which was how you could prove that it was done right.
Now, not only the product, but we remember applying identical systems now to our administration department. So it didn't matter whether it was a product or a service, they were all going through this requirement, say, do, prove loop. Requirement, say, do, prove, requirement, say, do, prove.
And that was all taking place in the context of our internal market.
Yeah.
So that was helping people to decide what and when to do something. And now with our new recipe system, how to do it properly.
Yeah, so we've got now, just to really nail that one, yeah, is doing the right thing, which is meeting the requirements, doing things right, following the recipe. So we were conforming to the requirements and complying to the recipe. So we always knew we were covering doing the right thing and doing things right by such a simple system of requirements, say, do, prove.
And that, for us, that was a minimum required of a self-sustaining system, that you could cover what the right thing to do was and how to do that right. Yeah. So it sounds like it all went really well, but we stumbled into a little bit of a problem, primarily as we spilled it out into our administrative and management functions, because they weren't used to these constraints on them, which previously our production team were happy with. So it's not surprisingly the problems showed up in those administrative functions. So I'll give you an example. In our accounts team, they had the cash that was coming into our bank accounts for the business, and they had invoices to customers and supplier invoices, and they jammed them all these all together, and at the end of it, it all had to balance out. So the amount you had in the bank sort of had to reflect the net activity of the invoices from customers and suppliers. Only more often than not, it wouldn't. So what accountants do is they do something called
a journal entry.
A journal entry.
A special entry.
And the journal entry is
the fudge.
The fudge that makes it all balanced.
Because they've got the cash, you see, they can't hide the cash, but they can fudge the rest.
Yeah, and it doesn't really matter that much. It all happens in the accounts machine, IT system. Well, of course, in our system, we now had customers and suppliers internally, and it was important to them because they were getting bonuses based upon the transactions that were taking place. So as a customer, they were saying, oh yeah, I've got to pay my supplier. And the supplier was saying, oh yeah, but this is cash coming to my virtual bank account in the business, my spreadsheet. And of course, when the accountant fudged the numbers, somebody gained or somebody lost.
It was uproar.
Well, there was never uproar from the supplier's side, because if they got more money than they really deserved, or the customer side, if a payment was never recorded, they were gainers. But because there were two people checking each one of these transactions, inevitably the loser would complain. And of course, what we then found was lots and lots and lots of problems
in our accounts department,
and
more than we could ever have imagined. It was a nightmare.
And at one point, our accountant told us unequivocally that this was quite outrageous, and none of his other clients expected him to behave with such fidelity down to every last penny.
And it wasn't fair.
Yeah, and it wasn't fair. Yeah. And all our people in our organisation wanted was a true reflection of the transactions that were occurring between them. And what was interesting on reflection about that was it wasn't just our accounts department, our management and admin teams were all a bit the same. It was clear that they had no culture of quality or inspection in their processes. It always kind of just muddled along with stuff they've been doing for years. It was habit.
It was process habit, wasn't it? It was just they followed the process, yeah, and they didn't really look at the outcome.
And if you got a complaint, it was more likely they justified it,
yeah,
rather than like in the production department, who had to resolve it and then show that they'd fixed the faulty goods, and then they'd made it so the problem could never happen again. All these things come into play in production, but it wasn't happening in the admin area.
Well, the truth was they had learned, isn't it, to manage expectation. So whereas in the production departments, they had learned to do what the customer wanted of them. In the accounts department, they had learned to manage expectations of the hierarchy.
And also, being admin and management, they tend to have more of an authority in our old hierarchical system. So
True.
There was a little bit of a bluff and bluster that sort of says, you know, I'm your boss, so don't you question me, lad.
Anyway, it's a magic process. You don't understand it.
So what did that do for us eventually is it, as we pass these functions more and more down to the operators in our organization, we decided that we needed to police these rules, these recipes, much better than we were before. It's not good enough to put a speed limit sign on the side of the road. You need a policeman occasionally to catch speeding drivers as well in order to get changes of behavior. So we decided in the end that what we had to do is we had to put in an independent monthly audit that looked at every recipe that an individual had been followed that month, and make sure they kept the proper records for each inspection gateway.
So that covered not just the quality issues associated with our product, which you would expect from something like ISO 9001 or similar, but it also covered all the admin stuff, so that the admin stuff has been covered by audit as well. And normally in a traditional company, most of audit focus, and certainly quality audit focus, is on the production, on the design, and even the sales department. And essentially these departments, these admin departments, miss out. We were making sure now they were being audited, because as we passed these admin processes into each of the cell, we had to treat them with equal weighting.
It's fair to say that, you know, we had 200 and something recipes, and we're doing a monthly audit of them. And what we've discovered at the end was we had lots and lots of problems. So it wasn't really a process of saying, oh, everything's like a well-oiled machine. What we uncovered was a little bit of a worm pit of processes which weren't being followed properly and weren't being recorded properly, especially on our admin and management side. They were also very expensive because, remember, in our internal market, they were charged. So there's a customer-supplier relationship with everything. And as a result of that, more and more of those administrative recipes now were being taken on by the cell because it was in their best interest to do so. They could cut their costs dramatically by doing a little bit of admin. And finally, I'd say if we got all these hundreds of recipes together in a big chart, and Nancy's got a picture of it, this set of recipes, what we called our recipe library, actually form our business model.
So I'm going to take over here, if I may, for a little bit, just to explain it, because I did all the hard work. As Mr. Wilson reminds me every time, that the truth is that I had to write the requirements down. This was our first, I call it the first bicycle. This was the first holistic business model that was placed upon each cell in our business. And on the top, you'll see the value added elements of it. That's sales, design, and manufacture. You could call it production or DevOps, depending what market you're in.
This could be service.
Could be service as well, exactly. And the bottom of it, the pink, is all the administration, covering from quality to accounts, etc. Now, this formed the basis of devolving these activities into the cells, and we put them on huge boards and we placed them up on the wall of our unit, and so that everybody could see them. So nobody was under any illusion of what the scope was. Now, it looks a lot, but the real truth is there's not that many that were mandatory. There's a few ones that you won't see it, but they're highlighted in red, and they were mandatory.
Some of these recipes, these cards which represent our recipes, have red borders, and those red borders saying you have to do this, they're mandatory. And most of those mandatory ones occur in the pink section, which is the admin and management side. Whereas there's far less in legal requirements in sales, design, and manufacturing.
Yeah. So the point here now is this is our first holistic model, and I think that's such an important thing because most people, most employees, don't see the whole; they see the part, their bit in the whole. Whereas our employees now, we're seeing the whole, albeit for a smaller number of outcomes. They were still seeing the whole problem, and they were now beginning to see that they could make great savings in all of this. They say, well, some of these we're not going to run very often. In fact, there's about 10 recipes in there that represent 80% of the volume of recipes, if that.
So, for example, an employee would run their monthly payroll, the mechanics of the payroll before it's submitted to for payment. They'd run that themselves, and there were some things they needed as ingredients for that, which were like an audit sign off from the auditor to say I've done my control job correctly for that month. But there wasn't, people weren't having to follow all of those. They tended to specialize in some, and the ones they did, 80%, as Andrew said, probably represented 10 or a dozen recipes, and they were just familiar with them. It was easy.
Now, behind each one of these recipes, by the way, was a requirement and a say and a do and approve. So they could access for each recipe what was the underlying requirement that was driving the need, what the process was, the forms and the process flowchart behind it. That's the say. They could then fill in the form, follow the process. Yeah, that was the do, and then they could prove that they met requirement. Fantastic. Now we had a complete quality system, based on requirement, say, do, prove.
I think I should just try to.
Nancy's she's telling us about time, probably.
No, I just wondered, do you want to see if people would like to ask a question about what you've just described?
How far have we got to go? We haven't got to, Nancy,
we've
we've got 2 minutes to finish our bit, and then we can fire any number of
another 7
questions.
minutes.
Okay.
Yeah,
So I just want to make one thing clear here now. So we had all these people, just like in the supply chain, who were all doing different jobs of one sort or another. And the benefit of doing what we were doing was that we could look at QDP and C as a high-level measures, and we could judge those equally across everybody, across every function. It was a meritocracy on these numbers alone. It wasn't about if you're in the accounts department or in your production department, you had different measures. It was always the same. So we could run this meritocracy, and because we had all these recipes, we could say, well, now we have that, we can identify the fact that when you run a recipe, you've got to do it right. And if you do it right, then you can be judged accordingly in terms of merit. Now, we could even then say, actually, that requirement to do things right, we can put those in the contract of employment. So no matter what people did, there's in their contract of employment said, if you've got to work out using the internal market what you should do and when you should do it, and using the recipe system to determine how you should do it properly. And in doing so, keep accurate and complete records.
So I just want to come in here with just to explore responsibility and accountability here. So we've created this barrel-like responsibility. In many ways, it's a trap.
Like a wine barrel.
Like a wine barrel, okay? And before, there was lots of holes in it. But now, there's no holes in it.
So accountability and responsibility in our old system would leak out. They blame somebody, they blame the boss, or blame a subordinate, or blame a subcontractor.
Or blame a colleague, even better. Sales department's fault. Did you know that?
They sold the wrong thing. Whereas in this system, there was no way, all the responsibility folded back onto you in terms of supplier and customer, and in terms of your output and your records.
But more importantly than that, I didn't know how to do that. I said, well, you must have known how to do that, because the system is clearly demonstrating to you a method of how to do it. So the excuses started to get less and less and less.
Yeah.
And the most important thing is responsibility. It's like a waterfall, it flowed down. Whereas in our old model, in the mechanical model, it was flowing up. So we changed the flow of responsibility and accountability. And the great thing about it now is it wasn't escaping. And that was a massive change. And that's something that I remember to this day, that we really felt we were moving forward. And it's almost like it sounds terrible, but it's like an existential trap. People were forced to bring their magic to work in order to, because they were trapped in this barrel of responsibility and accountability.
So they couldn't plead ignorance.
They couldn't plead ignorance.
And they couldn't plead that they didn't know that they had to sell enough of their services to pay for their own salary.
Yeah.
So the system as a whole held them account for their behaviors and was able to reward them for their success. So if they made a profit on their spreadsheet, we could give them a bonus for doing so. And pretty quickly, those bonuses grew and grew and grew, and so did productivity. And our costs fell and fell and fell.
And that's because responsibility and accountability was being devolved into a barrel which had no holes in it.
One of the tricks we would do is if somebody came to us and said, well, I don't know how to do so-and-so, we'd put them on training to do a recipe. And of course, they'd find that such a pain, they'd just go and read the recipe and do it themselves.
I think that's us just about
finished.
We're
done, we're sorted.
Nancy, I think it's you. Do you want to?
We have a couple minutes that we got 3 more minutes. Would somebody like to ask a question? I know there was a question quite a bit earlier in the chat.
I'll read that one aloud. That was mine.
Hey, go ahead.
All right. As I hear this, it sounds like these practices would lead like every employee to pick up some kind of small businessy skills. They start to learn accounting, they start to learn some marketing, they start to learn process management and such. And I'm curious whether you've tracked, after this was established, did you start to notice that when people leave the company, more of them were leaving to start their own business as opposed to being someone else's employee?
Mixture,
Yeah.
bizarrely.
Look, one of our fears of doing this was that people would start their own businesses and then, or even steal our own work. But we didn't find that at all. And that's partly because in this open book accounting, they could see what benefit there would be of doing this themselves. And
So that's really important. I don't want to, so when you're honest and open, the net benefit to them would have been a 20%. So what I mean by that is, yeah, if they started the business up themselves, they'd have to do all the stuff that we did, yeah, and all they would get was an additional 20% because the rest either goes to them or stays in the business.
Or goes to taxman.
Or goes to taxman. The only bit they would have saved is the 20% to Julian and I.
They pay to us as investors. So they could see the upside of starting their business was plus 20%, but they'd have to bring their own capital to the project. And we kind of arranged it so that the upside for them was so great that by the end of the year, they could do better than starting a business and the upside for them in 2 years. So I hope that answers your question.
Nice.
We did see people, we saw three things. One is people not wanting to do this and go back into a very constrained role. Secondly, we saw people getting much better jobs than they would have otherwise have got. Definitely. Because they had a wider portfolio of skills. And thirdly, some started their own businesses.
So a lot of them went into project management, by the way.
Yeah.
So they would, because they had a wider skill set, both in terms of financially, in terms of quality and other, and actually they had been used to working under the constraints of an organizational model or a quality management system. They were actually really worth a lot more than they had previously been.
Yeah, in the open market.
Yeah.
Okay, tell you what I'm going to do. We are going to do an extra little period of questions, but for those who need to leave us now, I'm just going to do my wrap-up slide. Here we go. I just want to let people know that it's not too late if you want to sign up for this seminar. We designed it so that people could join it at any time, even after the last one, because you still would get access to all the videos and you get the book. But anyway, you can still join. If you have colleagues who might be interested, please tell them about it. Our next two seminars are on this slide. What happens next is as the cells take more and more responsibility, the control of the company becomes much more like a roundabout. In other words, everybody is participating in the control in a genuine way. And in seminar 6, we're going to talk about what's happening now with this business model. And also for the next chapter, we are going to be covering chapters 10, 11, 12, and 15 in the book. They're all very short, so don't let that scare you. Now, hang on, I normally end the video at this point, but we're going to allow some extra time now for questions and discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to go right back to Andrew and Julian. And well, maybe I'm going to Carolyn. Carolyn, what would you like to say?
I want to make sure that in terms of housekeeping that we addressed some of the earliest question, which was from Mark before others joined. There was also, so Mark will come, I'll have you say that out loud in a minute. But there was also the ask for a more detailed slide of the recipes. So Nancy, maybe we can come back to that at the end. Mark, do you want to unmute and ask?
Yeah, so Julian and Andrew, in the book, you mentioned that the admin recipes turned out to be the simplest if they were devolved all the way to the level of an individual. And so I was curious how you reconciled the recipe responsibility existing at the level of the individual for administration whilst the work being arranged in teams in cells.
Yes. Do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
So the cells, when they had teams in them, they would internally divide up various responsibilities. So some would choose to be like a mini manager within that cell, and then they do all the admin and management.
So there was essentially one controlling mind in that cell.
Yeah, and that suited some, but obviously that individual wasn't contributing to the physical work, the work processes, and so it became quite clear to the rest of the team members that in some sense they had to be supporting that one in order for them to all get paid what they needed to be paid.
Because they're only paid for the stuff they added value on.
Yeah, so we were sort of passing down in a virtual sense all our invoices from customers, all our payments into the business through the cells and then back out to everybody through our internal market. And so they couldn't get to keep more than their just share was, because they'd be having to pay their colleagues and other cells for their contribution to the job. But it did mean of what they kept, they had to share it in the cell. And at that time, they would have been, because of legacy, on different pay rates and stuff like that. So all of that became quite transparent quite quickly. And for some, that was good. That maintained the status quo. And for others, that seemed unreasonable. So the more ambitious people were saying, well, I don't feel that there's any progression in this for me. I want to take on more. And if I wasn't in this team, I'd be able to do that.
So there's also the motivation by the person doing the administration to, let's say, eke it out so they didn't have to do any of the value-added work. So they could sit comfortably and just carry on the old behaviors.
This is a complex subject because wrapped up in this is a whole bunch of status anxiety for team leaders who didn't want to go back on the tools. So they would happily sit down in front of their admin desk and do all the admin stuff because somehow it was a more of a managerial role.
It bequeathed on them a higher status in their own mind.
Yeah, and that was important to them. Going back on the tools produced a lot of status anxiety. Does that answer your question? I hope it does.
Yeah, I think so. The fact that the profit of the cell was sort of how people were rewarded, along with at a perhaps higher level, sort of the quality of your personal work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. What else can I say? The administrative functions that remained in the business at that time in their administrative cells did seem hugely expensive compared to many, like an operator in a team who was doing some sort of repetitive production work was being paid a far lesser amount of money than the administrator, who now you could see the recipe they're following was relatively straightforward and adding up a list of numbers every week, and there was some, this isn't quite right.
It's really interesting, actually, when the operators began to see the role of the administrators, which the administrators were quite clever. It was always kept as this sort of black magic. You wouldn't possibly understand what I'm doing here, When it was actually written up on a board in small chunks, they said, well, wait a minute, I'm doing things more complicated than them, and they're only double what I am. How come that's not right? And of course, there was a little bit of upset. And of course, they then said, well, if this is the case, then, I want my own little cell. And I'll tell you what, I'll do that now. Because if I do that, I don't have to pay this person a whole lot of money. And it was a lot of money, by the way.
And in fairness, the smart ones, they worked all this out before they wanted a cell of their own. They'd worked out the what ifs. If I did this, they'd kind of war gamed it and said, actually, I'm much better off to do this.
So it was really beneficial for them to say, well, I'll start my own little micro cell out of this.
Yeah.
And they did a lot better, massively better. And of course, when the news spread that you can do massively better, it didn't take long for others to follow.
Yeah. So we were relying on in our little model, in our ecosystem model. We were relying on the opportunism of other members of the team to copy what worked.
Okay, would anybody else like to ask a question or make a comment? Why don't you just go ahead and unmute if you'd like? See, I don't see any.
Did we answer Noah's question? Noah?
No.
Like,
No, Karen, we haven't. I was expecting that.
yeah, that we need to make sure that, Noah, if you can come off mute, I know that want to make sure that the issue you raised about how sophisticated do these recipes need to be, can you speak to that?
That's essentially my question, yes.
So there's I'm going to answer this because I did the design initially. It's quite difficult because initially I went into too much detail and I analyzed probably too much analysis. And then I went around that loop again and synthesized it into something which was more doable and more understandable. And there's this balance between analysis of making it almost like perfect and synthesis of making it understandable. And there's no rights or wrongs in this. It's very much down, it's almost like an individual thing. Some people liked a lot of analysis in it and wanted a lot of detail and a lot of, let's say, hand-holding through the process. And other people just said, oh, yeah, I don't need that. Just give me a rough flavor of it and I'll fill in the rest. But going back to what we talked about though, remember our gateway reviews. So we said, how many gateway reviews do we need to control this particular process? If it was an accounting process, you'd say, well, 4 gateway reviews, bang, 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 and then the outcome. And that was usually sufficient. But I was guilty in the first place of over-analyzing and over-controlling. So I'd say less is more in this case. And if you can just put these little gateway reviews in, enough, you'll be rewarded because the people fill it in for themselves. As long as you give them these guiding gateways, they'll go through them. And they'll work out different ways of doing it as well. They don't all do it the same way. I don't know if that answers. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. It's not telling them how to do the work, just.
Yeah.
No, it's not.
But can I add something else that we did, which is quite important here? We designed the recipes as well, so they all conform to a format. So
a meta model.
Yeah. So if you think of a recipe book, when you open it up, each recipe there's a picture and an ingredients and then a method, and they all follow a format. So we decided what we called the recipe for creating recipes, and that allowed people to create recipes of their own for products, also for any new administrative process that they thought they wanted to include or improve. They could then go into the recipe for creating recipes and follow that and create a recipe of their own and then have it put into the system.
Now, just to give you some flavor here, you need a meta model, by the way, if you're designing a system. You need it for really simple things, just like identifying things. All the identification, numbering systems, etc., for the models are in the meta model.
So what Andrew's talking about there, if you've got a library, you've got all the books on the shelves, plus you've also got an IT system which categorizes all the books and gives them unique identifying numbers, and that's in the librarian's operating system. And so you need that, and then you need this standard way of treating every book when it comes in and is processed. So there's various layers like skin in an onion. Does that make sense?
So we designed the system, all out of a single meta model. So the first thing I did was to produce the meta model. Out of the meta model, I produced all the models and the whole system. So all I needed to control the whole system was one meta model, which was just one file, one blue file. And every time I turned the handle on my meta model, I had a green file. Guess what? Do you see the pattern? So it's exactly the same pattern that existed at the level below.
So what Andrew's talking about here is going from being involved in the business to working on the business. went from being a pilot to being an aircraft designer. And then we created like a rule book for the design process itself. So there's another layer on top of the design, which is like the instructions for the designer. And then there's a design, and then there's the airplane, and the pilot flies it.
So if you can imagine, so I produced the recipe for creating recipes, the meta model. That produced the models,
The recipes.
the recipes, yeah. And the guys in work, use that system, yeah, fly the system. So they're the pilots. So there's a kind of like there's the pilot level, and then there's a level above that aircraft designer level, but there's a level above that, which is sort of the fluid dynamics guy. The guy, system dynamics, fluid dynamics, the guy at the very top.
So
It's Nancy, what have we done wrong? I can't hear you, Nancy. Your red button's on.
Unmute yourself, Nancy.
Hang tight. So we have, I think that she's probably doing a time warning. I will alert her on chat. You finish your sentence. Mark had a question if there is time. Any other questions? This is a time to raise your hand and be counted so we can get you into the queue.
Is that Ed raising his hand?
I see Paul has a hand up. Let's recognize Paul.
Yeah.
I will text Nancy.
I was really curious about how easy it was for employees to modify these recipes, to influence them. And if you did, how did you sort of arbitrate where different sales wanted recipes to look different?
Oh, that's a very good question.
So we
good. Yeah.
So we started with the idea that there should be a common function. We should approach everything in a common way. And as time went on, we realized that when we have some people treat addressing one market and one set of customers, and others addressing different markets with different standards, we actually needed different models, and it was okay for them to have different standards. So this is part of the reason why we're talking about a meta model, because we could then say, well, in the meta model, it allows you to run even two systems yourself, one for commercial work and one for aerospace work, for example. And you could run different flow charts of workflows depending upon which is appropriate for your customer. Now, to speak to your question about how easy was it to modify, we use exactly the same as our normal document control system. So they'd make a controlled amendment. They'd then run it and see if it had a problem with the inspection gateway. And if they piloted it under strict conditions for a little while and proved it was good, then they could introduce it into their system, and they'd have the auditor double check that.
So they would, in effect, up-issue their organizational management system to another revision up because they made a change. So there's a challenge here, of course, is that because people, not only sales were operating different organizational models, but even within sales, they wanted to operate a different model. So for instance, one cell would be releasing to ISO 9001 to one customer, and then releasing another product to AS 9100. So we had to create a system, which allowed the individual to release to multiple release standards.
Well, I think I should just speak to one last thing here about this, Paul, because there's a trick in it, isn't there? That if you were to amend the inspection requirement, the gateway, the inspection gateway, well, your job would become easier.
Yeah.
So that's why we had this audit overview. The auditor had an overview of it, so that any amendment that came along wasn't you letting yourself off the hook. It wasn't saying, oh, if I didn't do this test, it'd be better. Well, of course it was. So if the policeman doesn't catch me speeding, I can do any speed. If I can slip that through, you know, with my car comes a special dispensation for being able to go at any speed I like, then it's a great trick, isn't it? So that's why we had an audit overview to check they weren't gaming the system.
Does that answer your question, Paul?
Yeah, I think so. There was just that second part about how you arbitrated when different sales.
Yeah, I'm going to come in on that one. So there's, first of all, it's very challenging from a quality perspective, obviously, because the quality guy, let's say you're doing a quality audit, a surveillance audit at the end of the year. The guy wants to come in and just see your organizational management and see how that's been applied universally to everybody in your organization. Now you're telling him that it's not, and therefore you have to have a different folder for everybody. Now your question was, sorry, can you repeat your question back to me again?
Well, if people can modify the kind of universal kind of recipes, how do you arbitrate when?
Yes, so that was part of my role. So we have in our system a loop which brings it back to me, so that because I was the original organizational model designer, and then they say, can I do this? And if it's a very, very simple thing like a spelling mistake or something, it doesn't impact the actual structure of the system, they can do it themselves. But anything that impacts the structure of the system and it's set in the system integrity, let's call it fit, form, and function, there's a loop back to me, and there's a tick in the box. I have to go, yes, you can do that.
So this, and for us, this is the role of leadership. And it's not just leadership in the system, but also if you're the designer of a product and somebody who's making it wants to change the method of which it's being produced, they have to go back to the designer of that product just to double check.
It's called the design authority.
That they're not doing something stupid when modifying the recipe, so they'll cut a corner, and the designer might say, yeah, no, that doesn't work. I tried that when I designed it, and there's a reason why. So we have people who are responsible for the design, whether it's a system or whether it's a product, who are a gatekeeper for significant changes.
Especially in the meta models. So if you've got a meta model, basically you want very little change in that, because that's driving a lot of behaviors at the model level. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Is there anybody we've not covered?
Fascinating. Would anybody else like to do a question? We probably should wrap up in a minute, but why not take one more? After all, people can catch up on video if they want to. Would somebody else like to make a question or comment? I'm checking to see if there's anybody with hand raised in the response button, or you can just unmute.
So I have a burning question. Did you make less money with all of these changes, you personally? I mean, one of the reasons that leaders like being leaders is like they want to make that big paycheck. It sounds like you redistributed quite a bit of that wealth, and it sounds like you're okay with that, but I'm just checking in here. I mean, like,
we made more money.
Yeah, we made more money.
We made more money. I was as rich as Croesus.
So let me be clear though, what we did, as we reduced our management admin team, it freed up reduced a lot of our costs.
50% of our salaries, because management and admin were a lot more expensive people than the guys on the shop floor. Roughly 50% of our salaries was going into management and admin.
So what Andrew's saying there is that admin and management took about 30% of our people, our head count, but they were better paid and they had offices and computer systems and a parking space near the door and all those perks that as we devolved that, we saved all that cost. We could pay, as our productivity raised, we could pay the workforce more as individuals, and we also were able to ring fence our return on our building, for example, as landlords, and we were able to ring fence our investment return from having our capital being deployed. So there's several ways that we were able to identify what value we were bringing and charge accordingly. But it was all open, so that the money from the customer went to the sale, and we were one of the people who charged them for
So we were
services.
charging capital 18% and working capital was charged at 18% and capital was charged at 12%. And Julian and I got the income from that. The capital was deployed.
And as a landlord, we got the rent, and we also got royalties from products that I'd previously designed and stuff like that.
And also I got income from deployment of the business management system. So our income was going up from the share of the profit, me from my deployment of the organizational management system that I designed, Julian from the products he designed, return on the capital for being bankers, in effect, bankrolling the organization. So we turned into landlords, bankers,
and
designers. And that was our role. And we never shouted at frogs. We gave up shouting at frogs.
So, and that was an invoice we gave everybody each month.
Well, not the frogs.
Sorry?
The invoice is for, so that would just put that in context, that we invoiced our people every month for capital, working capital.
For the services we provided.
For the services we provided, yeah. As a landlord, they pay that as well.
So what we get is all clear and upfront, just like any other supplier in the organization.
So there's absolutely no management in it. It's all self-management and self-leadership.